All right. I'm hopeful that we are live at this point. It's a little bit different doing this sort of virtual experience with the community and being in my own kitchen. Um, my name is Emily Styron, and I am the mayor of the town of Zionsville. And I welcome you to the very first in a series of 6 community conversations around social justice, implicit bias, racial inequities. It's this series was born out of the community's desire to have more open and frank conversations around race, around our community's degree of exploring where are we as a community as it relates to talking about tough subjects that our entire nation is grappling with. How do we create a framework and a forum for those who are interested in exploring a variety of different topics that at the heart of them are aimed towards creating more unity within our overall community? It's aimed to get more, to stretch our understanding of not just where we enter the world and our life experience and what we've seen and experienced, but to try to look at where our neighbor, where our coworker, where another member of our community, where their experiences may be different, and how we talk through and learn and become open to letting ourselves be informed by perhaps some ways that we see the world that have prevented us from understanding how other people experience the world. So with that fumbling sort of introduction, thank you for being here. There's more than 130 of us online right now, and that's pretty exciting to know that all of us are curious, all of us are open, and we're joining in together to learn a bit and think a bit and hopefully share some of that with each other. I would like to introduce you to Dr. Abbie Robinson-Armstrong. She has given so much of her time and talent towards creating the content for these community conversations. She reached out to Chief Spears and said, I have produced these sorts of materials for college classrooms throughout my career. Let me curate some content specific for our community during this time. And I am personally incredibly honored to get to know Abbie and to have her serve us in this capacity. I want to let everyone know that we will have a 30-minute Q&A session that will be at the end of this session, this material that will be presented by Dr. Robinson-Armstrong. And for those of you who have questions, use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your device or screen or whatever you're using to watch this tonight, and then type in your question. Type them in at any point. We will get to as many questions as time allows, and we will be capturing all of them as they come in. We won't break to stop and answer questions in the middle, but we will get to them at the end. And it is my great pleasure to introduce you to Chief Michael Spears. Chief Spears is leading ZPD's role in the series. His team at the police department are going through some of their own specialized curated training events with Dr. Robinson-Armstrong, but at the same time, they are here to participate and to listen and to play an important component to this community conversation. And with that, I will pass it on to Chief Spears. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Mayor. It really is a privilege to be a part of this discussion tonight, and I welcome each and every one of you here. Obviously, we wish we could be in person. We will at some point, but this is just too important an issue to not to get on it. So thank you for being here. Much thought has gone into these discussions. I want to thank everyone who's helped organize this teleconference this evening and the ones which will follow in the future. But most of all, thanks to each one of you for your interest and your commitment to ensuring inclusion, acceptance, and respect for all persons within Zionsville. Zionsville is a special place. I've been very impressed in the time I've been here. It's leading the way for others as we openly examine and discuss important societal issues, expand transparency, and improve our service for the community. Last week, many members of our community joined members of our police department in a discussion in Mulberry Fields, and it was very valuable. And I appreciate everybody who was there, and we look forward to continuing those in the future. Last week, all members of our police department also received training in implicit bias. We're working to better understand how our life experiences influence our actions and affect others. We're very, very fortunate to have an experienced and respected instructor who volunteered her time and talent to work with us, expecting nothing in return. Dr. Abbie Robinson-Armstrong, PhD, is a Zionsville resident and a former vice president for intercultural affairs and professor at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, California. She has a very impressive resume and decades of experience in higher education. During her 18 years at Loyola, Dr. Robinson-Armstrong designed and implemented an internationally renowned evidence-based program on identifying and mitigating implicit bias. Participants have included over 8,000 executive and mid-level administrators, professors, teachers, staff, and students from across the United States and Canada. She has a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Indianapolis, my alma mater, a Master of Science degree from Indiana University, and a PhD from the University of Toledo. She's graciously volunteered to lead our community conversation tonight and 4 other sessions. Tonight, Dr. Robinson-Armstrong will address the topic, the origin of implicit bias. We have 4 other programs scheduled in the next few weeks, including the impact of implicit bias on individuals, organizations, and society, managing the influence of implicit bias, systemic racism, what is the difference and who does it impact, and how can we improve racial justice? Again, I want to thank you all for being here. It's my understanding some members of the media are viewing this, and I want them to know how much I appreciate their attendance because they help us get our message out to a broader audience. Thank you, and it's my pleasure to bring forth Dr. Robinson-Armstrong.
Thank you very much, Chief and Mayor, for the opportunity to serve my new community, which is Zionsville. And I also want to thank the participants that are here tonight for the time that you are allotting to participating in this presentation. My part of the presentation is going to last about an hour. And if we go over, if we end up going over, I'm going to stop at the allotted time and I'll add whatever is left to the next Thursday's presentation, because this is a 3-part presentation. So let's begin with some opening thoughts. The first thing I want to do is to talk about, let's begin with the overview. The overview more or less contains all of the information that we hope to share tonight. So we're going to, the introductions have already happened, so we'll go from there to opening thoughts and then guidelines for all of us and the learning objectives that we hope we walk away with. And then we'll get into implicit bias and from there into how the mind works, system 1 and system 2 thinking. So if we can go to opening thoughts, which are really important in doing this kind of work. I've found that it's really important to begin with thoughts about bias, because bias is a very difficult topic to talk about. And so the purpose of this presentation and most other bias presentations I've done is not to blame any person or any group, and we need to say that up front. The goal of this presentation is to empower all of us to understand and confront and manage our own biases. And hopefully this presentation will present principles that are applicable to all groups. Let's move to the guidelines. We're hoping that all of us tonight will strive for intellectual humility. We're also hoping that we'll be willing to grapple with challenging ideas and be able to differentiate between opinion, because all of us have opinions, and informed knowledge from the social science research. I am bringing you the knowledge that I have garnered from the social science research that I participated in for almost 35 years. Another guideline is to hold our opinions very lightly with humility, and to notice if we're defensive, notice our defensive reactions and attempt to use those reactions as an entry point for gaining deeper self-knowledge rather than as a rationale for closing off. And finally, we're getting to the end of our guidelines. Participate freely. We want you to participate freely. And when you ask questions, use the term, use I statements as opposed to you statements. And then for those of you that tend to be quiet in a discussion, we want you to step up. If you tend to talk a lot, we want you to step back and to give other people an opportunity to talk. Listen actively, listen to understand, and respect others regardless of the stage that they're in. You know, each of us is in a different learning stage and experience with the concept of implicit bias. And the final two guidelines are confidentiality. Whatever we discuss here on Zoom, we hope that it remains on Zoom. Please silence your phones. And then the question that I'm going to pose is, are there any other guidelines that we should add before we get started? Hopefully we all agree with these guidelines. So let's move on to the learning objectives. Why are we here? What do we want to learn? What do we want to accomplish? Well, first of all, we want to be able to, hopefully at the end of this presentation, understand implicit bias and understand why it matters for the pursuit of diversity, inclusion, equity, and living better together. We also want to be able to compare and contrast implicit and explicit bias. That's very important. We need to know the distinct difference between those two concepts. And finally, we need to understand how our own minds work in relation to implicit bias, and we need to be able to demonstrate knowledge that we acquire tonight and the knowledge that you acquired from all of the articles that I know you all read that were sent out to you earlier in the week. So be able to demonstrate this new knowledge by engaging in intentional behavioral changes to reduce the activation and application of your own biases. So what is bias? What is bias? Can you go to that one? We can come back.
Let's see.
Go to the next one.
Next. There it is.
Okay, so what is bias? Can they talk? Okay. Bias is an inclination or preference that's in favor or against a person, a group, or an idea or value. And it generally results in unfair attitudes and compromising our ability to make impartial judgments. So it leads us to then the next question, which is, what actually is implicit bias then? There are two types of bias. Excuse me. There are two types of bias. There's explicit bias and implicit bias. Implicit bias, more or less, we have a definition of implicit bias that we want to walk away with to make sure that we understand the definition clearly that was put out there by the scientists. Implicit bias is basically attitudes and stereotypes that we hold, and want to make sure that we understand that we hold those unconsciously. We are not conscious of all of the attitudes and stereotypes that we have in the back of our head. Explicit bias itself is the kind of bias that we express directly. We are aware of the bias. It operates consciously. We make statements. We are very good at telling people exactly what we like and what we don't like, what we will and what we won't do. An example would be a sign in the window of an apartment building that says, "We don't rent to blank." Implicit bias, on the other, is expressed indirectly, and we're going to find out what do we mean by expressing bias indirectly. Nevertheless, we're always unaware of that bias, and it operates in the back of our head, and it really doesn't ever show up until there's a stimulus that brings it to the forefront. An example would be that where a property manager is doing more criminal background checks on African Americans than on whites, but not really understanding or being cognizant of the fact that that person is actually doing that. So what do you think? I'm going to let you take a minute. Implicit bias is nothing more than beliefs that people choose not to tell others. We know how we feel. They know they can't or shouldn't say those beliefs aloud, so we hide them. Now, at the end of the presentation, I'm going to ask you whether you agreed with that statement or whether you didn't agree with it. If you read all of the literature that I sent to you, you may or may not agree with it. But anyway, it's a good starter. It's a good question to put in the back of our head while we're moving through this presentation. So here we are, implicit bias. It can be both favorable as well as unfavorable attitudes. And as I said before, those attitudes are activated without our awareness or in kind of intentional control that's different from, and sometimes in contrast to, explicit self-reported beliefs. And most of us have no issues with reporting our explicit beliefs. One of the things I want to excuse me, one of the things I want us to walk away with, one thought I want us to walk away with, is the definition of implicit bias as opposed to the definition of prejudice. Implicit bias and prejudice are two totally different concepts. So I don't want anyone in this presentation to walk away thinking that we're talking about prejudice and racism. Implicit bias, as you can see on the screen, is unconscious preference. When a person consciously rejects the idea of preferences or partially holds negative associations about certain people, perceived groups, ideas, or values unconsciously in their mind. Prejudice, on the other hand, is actual beliefs, thoughts, and attitudes that we hold about a group. Prejudice is not based on experience. Instead, it's a judgment originating outside of our experience. We also need to understand the difference between implicit bias and racism. Again, you can see what the definition of implicit bias is, but let's pay attention right now to the definition of racism. Racism is a stronger type of prejudice used to justify beliefs that one racial category is somehow superior to or inferior to another category. It's also a set of practices used by racial majorities to disadvantage a racial minority. The Ku Klux Klan, for example, is a racist organization. Its members believe in white supremacy. has encouraged over, has had that belief for over a century of hate and hate crimes and hate speech. So we need to understand tonight that we are not focusing on prejudice and racism, that all of us have implicit biases, but that does not make us prejudiced, nor does it lead to racism. Research has documented that implicit bias is linked to everything. There are over 10,000 studies in the databases, social science databases, on age and bias, body shape and bias, disability and bias, ethnicity and bias, gender and bias, gender identity and expression bias, immigration status and bias, national origin and bias, political affiliations and bias, race and bias, religion and bias, sexual orientation and bias, and socioeconomic status. There are huge amount of studies on bias and race specifically, and a lot of studies as well on bias and national origin, and numerous studies out there on bias and social economic status. Now, I gave you earlier on several articles that can link to various of these human characteristics that we are discussing at the moment. I think you have information on, on education, for example, where bias is linked to socioeconomic status in the sense that the children who come from higher income homes tend to have a better educational context. And so we're not going to focus on that tonight, but we're not going to get into that in any depth, but we need to understand that bias is linked to every human characteristic that we have. So another question I want you to be thinking about. I'm fully aware of my thoughts and actions, and I make all of my decisions based on facts and evidence. Therefore, implicit bias does not affect my behavior. Now, again, you had all of those articles, and I know you've all read them all. And some of you already have some background in this, with the concept of implicit bias. So at the end of the presentation, perhaps we can come back to this question that I'm posing at this moment. So how common is implicit bias? Well, 30 million people completed Harvard University's implicit association test. And if you haven't completed that test, I would strongly encourage you to go online and complete the implicit association test. All you have to do is put in implicit association test, which is usually referred to as the IAT. 80% of those who completed the IAT related to age exhibited a negative implicit bias against the elderly. There are 18 implicit association tests, and the 18 tests coordinate with all of the human characteristics that we just covered a minute ago. 75% of those who took the test, the 30 million who took the test, so 75% of whites and Asians demonstrated an implicit bias in favor of whites compared to African Americans. Implicit bias, as you already know, because you have all those articles, it impacts every domain. It's in business and industry. And by the way, it's wonderful today to see that numerous businesses, corporations are trying to do something about it. They have training on implicit bias all over the United States, Canada. In fact, that training is going on all over the Western world. I was in Berlin last year, and there were universities from all over the world there, and part of the conversation was about the implicit bias training that's going on in every Western country, Western nation, I should say. We also know that it impacts law enforcement, it impacts criminal justice, it impacts K-12, and of course it impacts my area of education, which is higher education. In fact, one of the studies that came out just recently, as you know, higher education is very, very proud of it, the fact that it tries desperately to be diverse. So colleges and universities across this country, and not just across this country, but across many other Western nations, they aim to enroll a very diverse student population, primarily because they believe that it's through that diverse student population that students learn how to be citizens of the world. So one of the things that several studies pointed out recently is that institutions that basically have issues with diverse student population, that the issues actually begin with the director, whoever is in charge of admissions, because that person is looking at the prospective students through his or her own sort of eyes, and that person then has the right, and I guess that person can make the decisions as to who comes into the university. So many institutions are now trying to do something about that and make the change so that they can get to a complete diverse institution, and so that their students will be prepared to live and work in a diverse world. We also know that Health and Human Services admits that there are numerous biases and that those biases impact individuals. In fact, if you think about recently the COVID-19 and the new statistics that came out that showed that elderly people as well as people of color were the ones that were impacted by COVID-19 more so than others. And I was very proud of my alumni, the university, one of the universities I graduated from, Indiana University, when I saw that Indiana, IU Health, doctors were out protesting when COVID-19 hit us really hard, and because they really wanted to make sure that the hospital and everybody else knows that they're focusing on trying to provide equitable services for all of their patients, and that was a real plus in my I was very happy to see that. And of course, you know, there's no dispute. We all know that there's been bias in housing for as long as there's been housing. Now, another question to put on the table. It's a waste of time to try to mitigate my implicit biases because they don't impact anybody anyway. It's a waste of time. Well, let's see if they impact anybody. Implicit biases impact all of us, and they impact our actions. For example, from a perception point of view, implicit biases impact how we see people and how we actually perceive reality. They impact our attitudes, how we react towards certain people. They impact our behaviors, how receptive or friendly we are towards certain people. They impact our attention. Which aspects of a person do we pay most attention to? In the United States, we tend to pay a lot of attention to people's eyes because our culture sort of trains us to smile when we walk next to a person or walk by a person, even if we don't know that person. So we pay a lot of attention. We also pay a lot of attention to a person's eyes because we believe in the United States, right or wrong, that the eyes tell all kinds of stories. So if I'm talking to someone in a business environment and I'm looking away instead of looking directly at that person. The person in some instances could, if they didn't understand that in my culture, which is not, I'm making this culture up now, but if they didn't understand that in my culture, it's not appropriate to actually look someone in the eye. So if they didn't understand that, then they feel that I'm being disrespectful. Our bias also impacts our listening. It determines how much we actively listen to what certain people say. If we have an implicit bias, negative implicit bias against a particular person or a particular group, we don't listen as carefully to what they have to say as we would if we had a positive implicit bias against those people. And finally, in terms of actions, bias also affects our micro affirmations. In other words, it determines how little we feel comfortable, how much or how little rather we feel comfortable with certain people in certain situations. And I'm sure that some of you may agree with this, especially when you think about situations that you've seen them on the television, you've heard it on the radio, heard it everywhere, where, for example, people walk into areas where there are homeless people and feel very uncomfortable in that particular situation. So what they do is they try to separate themselves as much as possible away from those individuals. So, you know what? Bias also impacts not just our actions, but it also impacts our nonverbal behavior in terms of body language. For example, facial expressions. It impacts our posture. And I already talked about the fact that it impacts our eye contact, gestures, and our emotional displays. It also impacts our social distancing. And I just gave you an example of social distancing when you actually move away from individuals that you feel some sort of negative bias toward. But I want to make it clear before we move to move to the next slide. If you can go back to that one, I want to make it clear that in most instances, no problem. Sorry. No problem. In most instances, we are really we're more comfortable in a situation where we are with our social in-group. And our social in-group is our families and our friends and our colleagues that we know and we feel quite comfortable with. So I just wanted to make that point clear before we moved on. Let's go on to the next one. Now, there are many situations that occur that actually create issues for us and make us sort of rely on implicit bias. We rely on implicit bias when we are confronted with ambiguous or ambiguity. We rely on implicit bias when we are in a cognitive overload moment, or we're dealing with complex decisions. We also rely on implicit bias when we get incomplete information. In fact, what the scientists tell us is that what we do is when we get incomplete information, we just sometimes we fill in the blanks ourselves without the accurate information. We also rely on implicit bias when we're in an emotionally overload, like when we're stressed and when we're angry and when we're frustrated. Also, when there's a lack of clear criteria for decision making, or when we are fearful or we feel threatened, or where there's a lack of familiarity with an individual or with a group, or when we're actually doing lots and lots of things like lots and lots of us do every day. And also when we have to do everything in a very, very quick way, time pressures. So those situations make us rely more on bias than other situations if we had more time to think. I put this slide in here because often when I do these kinds of presentations across the country, people raise their hand and say, oh, well, you know what? I have a female friend. I have a white friend. I have a black friend. I have an Asian friend. So I can't be biased. Well, that's not what the scientists tell us. What the scientists tell us is all of us is susceptible to harnessing implicit associations about others based on the human characteristics of those individuals. These associations can affect our behavior toward others, even if we wanted to treat everybody equally or genuinely believe that we're egalitarian. And to be honest with you, almost everybody that I know believes that they are genuinely egalitarian. They also always want to treat people, everybody, equally. However, scientists disagree with us and say, no, well, yes, we do have those thoughts and they're wonderful thoughts, but we also have this bias in the back of our head. So what happens sometimes in the cases where we feel like, oh, I'm not biased, actually, I'm not biased, is the more we feel that we are unbiased, then the more biased our behavior, because we're not checking anything. We're not checking ourselves. This slide I put in here because I wanted to ask you to think about, and hopefully you can take a few minutes to think about it. You've read some articles. We've talked a little bit about the fundamental concepts of implicit bias. So I want you to take a few minutes, think about it. I'm going to take a few minutes. And then what I want you to do is I want you to make a list of what you think are the fundamental concepts of implicit bias so far. In other words, how would you identify implicit bias? Or if I were in your classroom or your home or wherever, and I asked you, tell me about implicit bias. What do you know about that topic? Take a minute, write down everything you know right now about implicit bias so far. Okay, I'll share a couple of ideas. One is that implicit biases operate outside of our conscious awareness. We made that clear already. And implicit biases are unconscious, they're automatic, and they rely on associations that we form over time. Let's talk a little bit more about implicit biases and fundamental concepts. We know that they're automatic, they're activated involuntarily. And we know that they can be activated without intention or without being explicitly controlled. So here's a question for you at home. Have you ever specified someone's race or ethnicity when it wasn't necessary? For example, referring to someone as a black doctor or a Latina lawyer or a white cashier? Think about it. Another fundamental concept, bias is pervasive and robust. Everyone possesses implicit biases, even people who are vowed commitment to impartiality. So here's a self-reflection question for you. Have you ever avoided sitting next to someone in a public place based on how you perceive their race, their ethnicity, their religion, or their ability or socioeconomic status? Think about it. Let's move on to another fundamental concept. In-group favoritism. We tend to hold implicit biases that favor our in-group. I already said that once. Now, let's reflect on that. I want you to think about your three best friends. Your three best friends. Do they look like you? Think about it. let's go on to one last concept about implicit bias. Implicit biases, according to the scientists, are malleable. Our brains are incredibly complex, and the implicit associations we've formed, according to scientists, can gradually be unlearned through a variety of mitigation techniques. So here's another question, very important one. Have you identified any of your own implicit biases and actively engaged in mitigation techniques to address them? I'm going to self-identify at this moment rather quickly. I grew up in Florida, northern Florida, in the Tallahassee area, and I heard growing up lots of information on television, many racist statements, especially those made by George Wallace. And I began as a young child to associate racism with a deep Southern accent. And that bias sort of stayed around in my brain for some time. I never knew it was there until, and it never came to fruition until I would come in contact or hear that deep Southern accent. So I ended up going to college, and somehow or another I sat in my English class right next to another college student who spoke with extremely difficult accent at first for me to understand. It was a very deep Southern accent. And she, reached out to me, and we began to talk, and we began to get to know each other. And as of today, we are best friends. In other words, we ended up being in each other's weddings, bridesmaids in each other's weddings, because we became that close of a friend. However, it was until I came in contact with her and learned that not everyone with a deep Southern accent is biased, at least racist. In other words, we're all biased. I shouldn't say that we're not, she wasn't biased, because we all are, and so am I. But at least I learned that I needed to stop and think prior to making a judgment about somebody's accent and what they actually believe or what was in the back of their head. So that's an example of, trying to actively mitigate the bias that I held for so many years as I was growing up in Tallahassee, Florida. So self-reflection. I want you to think about it. What are some of your own biases? You remember I said you have positive biases and you have negative biases. What are some of the biases you are aware of? For example, I have a negative bias against frogs. And I tell this to a lot of people because growing up in Florida, in that part of Florida, we have tree frogs. And you can be outside and the tree frogs jump out of the tree and jump down on your head. Well, that's not a very pleasant experience. I didn't really care for it. And to this day, I really don't care for frogs. So, and I understand that I have a negative, implicit bias against frogs. But when frogs come into my context, what I just do is I either walk away or I make sure that, I don't do anything to hurt them. But I know that I don't like them, put it that way. And I think the frogs know that too, because they typically hop on down the road. I want you to reflect on the possible effects of your own biases on other people. How might your biases toward other people affect how you shape your life? Remember, we talked about earlier that your biases affect your behavior, and especially your nonverbal behavior. So how might your own biases toward other people affect how you shape your life? What time is it?
It's 1:45.
Okay, good.
Almost 10 till, yeah.
All right, so we want to move on to another segment here. How does the brain use shortcuts to process the stimuli that's coming into our brain? And remember, we talked about the fact that when the stimuli comes in, we can categorize it into a negative or positive bias, depending on what it is. So according to Daniel Kahneman, who is a Nobel laureate and wrote this book, Thinking Fast and Slow. It was published in 2011. According to Kahneman, the brain is actually divided, and we don't mean physically divided. That's not what he means. This is a theory. It's not about physicality. So the brain is actually divided into two systems, thinking systems. System one operates automatically, intuitively, and it's involuntarily, and it's effortlessly. It has no sense of voluntary control. Therefore, system one acts as on a mental shortcut that may not be accurate. It may be accurate, sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. System one corresponds to our emotions, our instincts, and our intuitions. This system guides our daily habits, and it helps us make immediate decisions and react instantly to dangerous life and death situations. So we definitely need the system to be up and running all the time. For example, when you're driving home from the grocery store, you're on autopilot in most instances, unless you just moved to the neighborhood. This is not an operation that demands a whole lot of strategic thinking. So traveling this route is a previously learned behavior. And so your system one thinking, which includes deeply embedded memories, you drive out of the parking lot, you turn right, and you keep going down the road, is doing most of the work when you're on your way home. System two, on the other hand, according to Kahneman, requires slowing down, deliberating, solving problems, reasoning, computing, focusing, concentrating, and refraining from jumping to conclusions. System two allots its attention to the effortful mental exercises that demand it, including complex computations. This system helps us to handle complex mental exercises such as managing individual and group relationships, logical reasoning, learning new information and gathering, and patterns of thinking and behaviors that really aren't natural to us. New information, new stuff coming into our system. System two also it consists of conscious reasoning self that has beliefs, it makes choices, and it decides what to think about and what to do. It requires attention and lots of detail. For example, if I were to ask you right now to separate a deck of cards into red cards and African American cards, you could do that without even thinking in 2 seconds. But if I asked you, on the other hand, to separate a deck of cards into suits, you'd have to stop and think about it as you move cards from one place to the other. So that's one of the examples of the distinction between system one and system two. Even though these two systems are interdependent, they have different functions. System one is fast, as I said before, it's automatic, it's unconscious, and it's effortless. System two is slower, it's conscious, it's controlled, it's deliberate, and it is effortful. Nevertheless, there's an interplay between the two systems. System one generates impressions and feelings and inclinations, and system two endorses those, whatever system one generates. It endorses voluntary actions, and it endorses intentions and the beliefs that we may or may not walk away with when we're in a situation. For example, when you're angry, your automatic system one is, in full force. If you're mad, And in a situation where you must remain calm, like if you're angry, you got angry at somebody, said somebody in the office, let's take it away from home. Somebody in the office said something that really, really made you mad. But you're in the office. So what can you do about that? Well, system 2 takes over, and system 2 says, oh, Abbie, now look, you're in the office. You gotta suppress your anger, and you got to live with these people. So you got to deal with them. So that's the way the two systems work together to keep us walking down the right road. So as you can see on this slide, I put it there for you to see the characteristics of the two systems. We have already discussed the characteristics. Now, what are the advantages? The advantage of system 1 is that the speed of response in a crisis. We need to be able to respond quickly. It's easy. We can easily complete a routine or repetitive task as long as the brain is operating in system 1. System 2, in terms of advantages, it allows us to be reflective. It allows us to consider the bigger picture and options and pros and cons and the consequences before we actually come to a conclusion in terms of making decisions. It can handle logic, it can handle math, it can handle statistics, and it's good for reductive thinking. What are the disadvantages of system 1? Well, one of the biggest disadvantages is the fact that we jump to conclusions. So we sometimes, when we jump to conclusions, the decision we make is inaccurate. Sometimes it's accurate. Also, another disadvantage of system 1 is the fact that it's unhelpful emotional responses. If we just, if we're in the office and we get angry and we just spout out, we haven't done any good for ourselves that day. Also, system 1 can make errors that are not detected and corrected, such as wrong assumptions or poor judgments or false causal links. System 2, though, because it's slow and effortful, it requires time. It requires effort and energy, which could lead to sometimes, this is what we call decision fatigue. Now, this is simply a metaphor that sort of gives us a good picture, a graphic of the two systems. As you can see, system 1 is below the surface, and the information below the surface is unconscious, and we are processing that information quickly and in a hurry. System 2 is all the information in our brain, which is above the surface, and we are conscious when we are processing that information. We are unconsciously processing system 1 information and consciously processing system 2 information. So I want you to look at this slide, and I want you to quickly read off the words that you see there, and then I want you to fill in the bottom. And I'm going to tell you what you fill the bottom in, because that's what most of us who are Americans fill the bottom in with. So I'm going to read it off. Apple red, lemon yellow, lime green, and most of us said sky blue. That was really easy, because that information is already stored in the back of our brain. We already have an association. When we see the word apple, we think red. We have an association with lemon and yellow. We have an association with lime and green. And we have an association with sky and blue. Now, I want you to answer this question rather quickly. Do not use your calculator. Some people try to cheat and use their calculator. We don't want you to use your calculator. The purpose of this slide is basically to show you and prove that the two sides of the brain operate differently, and you can almost tell when you are using either side of the brain. Unless you are a mathematician or a statistician, you have to calculate this. You have to do something. You have to compute to come up with the answer to this particular problem. And also, when you do that, you're operating in system 2. Now, to avoid errors, what do we have to do? Really, we rely on system 1 cognitive processing more than we realize. Most of us don't even think about when we're operating in system 1. But what Kahneman suggests we do is we take time when we come into contact with stimuli that we don't understand or that we don't already have a relationship with. We need to ask ourselves, Abbie, what are you thinking? Abbie, why are you thinking it? Is there a past experience that's impacting your current decision? Is there a past experience applicable now, or is it based on a preference of bias that you already had? So we need to think about that when we're making quick decisions. And moving on, I want you to consider the consequences of implicit bias. Why does it really matter that we understand that we have biases? Why is that important? What are some of the positive consequences to having a better understanding of your biases? Now, one of the positive consequences that I realized over the years is I have a friend who grew up in Mississippi and who speaks with a deep Southern accent and who has been with me for many, many years since college, since we were freshmen in college. And we have had lots of beautiful, wonderful experiences together. We've traveled to, all over the world together with our husbands and our children. We have been with each other when we were sick and when we were happy and we were not so happy. So all of that comes as a consequence to understanding that one bias that I had. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't have others. I have lots of others, but that one I can share with you. So what are some of the negative consequences to having a better understanding of your biases? Think about that as well. So why does it matter that we understand? Here's what the scientists tell us. It matters because we're all subject to implicit biases that come from larger social stereotypes and historical discrimination. It matters because research has documented that the impact of implicit bias in every domain. Remember, we talked about that. It matters because understanding implicit biases enables us to build skills to recognize bias and employ strategies to mitigate it. If you don't have any biases, then there's no need for you to build any skills to mitigate it or to employ any kind of strategies to mitigate it. So there are 2 upcoming conversations. The one is the impact of implicit bias on individuals, organizations, and society, and the other one is managing the influence of implicit bias. And by the way, I need to say that the Thursday, the 29th, is when we're going to talk about specifically mitigation strategies to manage your bias. All of our bias, not just your bias, mine and everybody else's. I want to thank you very much and hope you enjoyed this presentation.
Okay, we do have a few questions. And John, I was wondering if you could turn on, the first question is for our Boone County prosecutor, Kent Eastwood, and he is on the session right now. I was wondering if you could turn his microphone on so he can answer the question. I'll read it out loud. The question was, in view of the recent grand jury conclusions elsewhere, how will the Boone County Prosecutor's Office staff be introduced to this workshop? Have they been? If not, when will they be? And will all deputy prosecutors subsequently hired be required to complete such workshops?
Lordy.
And we're working right now on the prosecutor, Kent Eastwood, for Boone County is on the call right now. We're trying to get his microphone up and going so he can answer.
He's been promoted to a panelist.
Okay, I just got word, Kent, if you can hear me, you should be able to respond to that.
All right, I think I'm unmute this now.
We can hear you, Kent.
All right, great. Thank you, Liz. All of our education is put on by the Indiana Prosecuting Attorneys Council, and we are in the process. All elected prosecutors will be going through a training on this shortly, and then we are putting on a big training for all prosecutor employees available throughout the state. So we will be doing that. And we've also taken certain steps within our office to try to address implicit bias in what we do. One example is before we would get police reports and they would have the picture of the suspect on there. So we now print the police reports without the picture of the suspect. So any type of implicit bias by seeing maybe the gender or the race of the person, their picture would be removed. We've also, on occasion, sent reports back where maybe it identifies a person by race or gender when it's not necessary. And we then will give that case to a person who didn't see the original report, so as to take out any type of implicit bias that might be present.
Thank you, Kent.
Thank you.
Let me get this other question we had here. And this one, I think, Dr. Robinson, I think this question will be for you. Similar to your example of the education system, where the person in charge usually has the bias, does the same apply for any institution? The head of an agency or any institution, shouldn't this be the same logic apply?
The same logic applies to every organization, regardless of the type of organization. In every organization, yes, it's the same thing. And in fact, that's why you find that this kind of training is being implemented across the country. And as I said, across all of the Western nations, not just in schools and universities, but in corporate America, in corporations, in police departments, just everything, every entity you can think of, they are, if they really want to serve the people that they're supposed to serve, they are implementing this kind of bias training.
Thank you.
Yes, it does apply.
We got another question. Somebody wanted to know if they could share this information with their work colleagues. And the answer is that this is being recorded on our YouTube channel. So yes, you can. And okay, we have a question about how somebody could contact someone to offer this training and who does this training. So we can answer that question in an email. Let me see. Oh, she was wanting training on implicit bias. So we can answer that question on an email.
Mm-hmm.
Let me see here. That may be all the questions. That's all the questions we have up here for right now. One just popped up. Let me make sure. Okay. Do we have any, John, do we have anybody from the school system on the call, to your knowledge? We have a question about the school system here. No? Okay, I'll read the question, and we will definitely reach out to our school partners here in Zionsville and get the answer for you on this one. But it's the pre-read materials discussed how implicit bias in education can be extremely problematic for students. With the Zionsville school system having almost no racial diversity across its teachers, how should implicit bias be addressed effectively? So I guess you could answer that.
Well, and right now, in fact, this coming Monday, I am doing implicit bias training for the Taylor County School District. And here's how that really rolls out. Typically what happens is I try to train in a school district. I want to be able to train a team of individuals because, you know, training can go in the door and out the door rather quickly. So if you train a team of individuals to do their own training, then the training can go on forever. So right now I am going to be training 35 principals and administrators and lead teachers. And then those people will go back to their respective places across the school system, and they will train all the people in their system, in their areas. And that's really the most effective way that you can really sort of get a handle on bias. And especially when you've got a team of people ready to move in case, you know, you got the system ends up having questions or something happens, and you have people trained there in the system, all over the system, to be able to respond rather quickly. I've had a lot of success with that approach. I think that's the best way to go, is to do it, you know, to train an entire team, not one person, and not to do it one time, and not to try to, the other issue is, don't try to do, they shouldn't try to do the training in one setting. That's the reason I separated this training tonight into 3 different topics, related topics, because you need time in between each of the topics to sort of, think about it and get it into your cognitive framework before you move on to the next. And that's a problem for some organizations because they want you to come in and they want you to do the training all in one day. I don't do that kind of training, and most people won't. But it's best when you can pull together a team from across the entire system and then train that team and stick with that team for at least a year, so that when they have come up with, problems with the training, you can always answer the problems and help them through it.
Okay, and we have one more question that says, why is it more helpful to talk about implicit bias than racism?
Well, it's not more helpful. The two are different concepts. They're different constructs, and we don't necessarily want to talk about them, to merge them together. We want people to understand both, and they're both extremely important.
Thank you. Okay. Just want one last check here just to make sure I got everybody's questions. I have one more here.
Oh, can I say one more thing about that question?
Sure.
I try as a social scientist to try to begin with implicit bias, because in order for one to understand racism, more or less, actually bias is what constitutes racism. So if you can understand implicit bias, then you can understand, have a better understanding of racism. But the two topics are very, very important, and they should be covered in an extensive way. The same way I'm covering implicit bias, you could do the same thing with racism.
Okay. We have another one that says, oftentimes many organizations go through this type of training, yet nothing happens. They check the box, yet continue their practices with a lack of diversity, inclusion, and opportunity for minorities. What can or should organizations do immediately to change this? Minorities are tired of listening to all these conversations.
Well, organizations do sometimes show business, as far as I'm concerned. I don't do those kind of presentations, but show business to quiet things down in the organization. Now, here's what an organization can do specifically to ensure that changes will happen. First of all, the organization has to come up prior to the training, has to identify outcomes. Why do you want to bring a trainer into an organization, waste that person's time, waste the time of your employees, when you have no actual outcomes that are shared with the employees? So if the organization designs outcomes and everybody knows what those outcomes are, it's less, they don't have as much, problem in terms of achieving those outcomes, as opposed to not having any outcomes and nobody knows why the training happened. So typically I work with organizations to identify the outcomes. And the only way you can do that is to survey the people in your organization to figure out what the problems are.
Thank you. All right, so that was the last of our questions here. Again, I just want to remind everybody, we will not be having this next Thursday due to the fall break in the school system. So we will continue on Thursday, October 22nd, with the impact of implicit bias on individuals, organizations, and societies. And again, the sessions start at 7 p.m. and will end at 8:30 p.m. I think that's all. Thank you guys so much for your time here and for joining us this evening.
Just two more questions. Aaron Williams has two more things.
Oh, we did?
You see him?
Yes, I'm sorry. I was just made aware 2 more questions popped up. What advice would you give specifically to the Zionsville Police Department and the mayor to start making immediate changes? The representation of minorities is very poor.
First of all, I think the chief mentioned that last week we did a presentation on implicit bias for all of the police in the department, including the chief. And I was looking at prior to that, I looked at the strategies that the chief has put out to the general public about what's happening here, what's going to be happening here in Zionsville. So those strategies to me make a lot of sense. And I think that one of the strategies alludes to the fact that the police department needs to be diverse. It needs to represent the diverse population that is now part of the community of Zionsville. And from what I understand, they're already working on that. In other words, trying to recruit people of color in order to ensure that the department looks like the people that it serves.
Okay.
Now, the chief should mention those 5 strategies. You have 2 boards that you've put together. Mm-hmm. Plus you did that, you're doing the implicit bias training. And by the way, the police are also going to go through another set of implicit bias training in January. So they'll have a lot of hours in terms of implicit bias training. But the chief should probably tell them what the other things they're doing.
Yes, Chief Spears, do you want to talk about the 5 things that the Zionsville Police Department's been doing? We can't hear you.
My camera fell down.
You're good.
Well, Dr. Robinson's right. We're trying to do a lot of things to improve our diversity, and one of the things we're doing is opening our doors to the public and having more inclusion and more representation of the entire community within the organization. Include our use of force board, a newly established board, and we have 2 new community members on that. We're doing our very best to promote the work of the department publicly through a very comprehensive monthly report that's available to the public every month. Things like training, and the doctor helped us with last week and will continue to work with us, I think is very important, helping our officers understand that we do all have some biases and how to deal with those and do better. I will admit we need to do a much better job with recruiting, and I've reached out to a lot of people who worked with us and helped us, but we're not where we should be. And I welcome the assistance of others who have suggestions or methods that can be used to help encourage more minority applications so that we can represent our town in a proper manner.
Thank you. And we just had another comment come in. It's more of just a statement, not a question. It just says, I understand the population is 91% Caucasian and 9% other. What outcome would be reasonable in minority hiring?
Well, I don't, if they're asking for a statistical outcome, a statistic, based on my experience as vice president in a large university, you wouldn't come up with a specific number because that would be against the law. But what you try to do is you try to match beginning at least the percentage of other with the percentage of police that look like other. I mean, that would be the direction I would go, but I wouldn't actually have a specific number because that, from my understanding, you can't do that. In other words, you can't just say, I'm going to hire 10 this or 10 that. You got to hire, you strive to bring in enough people to represent the people that are out there. And then you move on and try to bring in as many more as possible. But in the beginning, what you try to do is you try to focus on, bringing in folks to meet, that look like the other.
Okay. Thank you. Okay.
In other words, you can't have a quota, is what I'm trying to say.
Yes.
That's against the law.
And another statement, great discussion so far. Sorry for the delay in the comment. Zionsville does not reflect diversity in any way. I hope that we do not wait until this series is over to bring about the change we have been talking about the last 6 months. And let me make sure. I believe that is all the questions. Okay. Yep. So that is all the questions for tonight. And again, like I said, we will continue our conversation series on Thursday, October 22nd at 7 p.m. And we look forward to hearing Dr. Robinson-Armstrong speak and your guys' conversations with us. So thank you all and have a great evening.
Thank you.